this whole weekend with us. I'd now like to call this House to order on the motion that this House, as a citizen of the world, welcomes and embraces the spread of English as a global language. The Prime Minister, please come up and defend yourself.
We think that the spread of one language has allowed for more communication, cultural exchange, knowledge production, increase in global understanding that would have otherwise been unacceptable if we did not have a spread of a global language. We think that this House, like stated, is a global citizen, so we think this would be any individual from anywhere in the world. We also think that the weighing mechanism within this debate, and the root of what we're discussing is, has the spread of English been or would be beneficial or harmful? We think that the affirmative would obviously decide that it's been more beneficial, and then the option say why it's been more harmful. And we also understand that English could be a language of oppression or could be viewed as why English, but we think that this round should be more debating about whether or not the spread of a language is a positive, not whether or not the spread of English is a positive. This brings me to my first point, which is communication. So we think that before a universal language, yes.
So would you advocate for some other language other than English? What are we talking about here? Are we specifically saying that there are some languages that are better in terms of facilitating this type of agreement, or what?
No, so we think that we are debating whether or not the spread of English has caused more harm or good. We think that the spirit of the motion is debating the spread of a language, but we will engage on whether or not English is accessible or whether or not English is a negative or a benefit. However, we think the spirit of the debate is whether or not the universality of any language is a good thing. On to my first point. We think that a universal language allows for communication, because we think that before there was a universal language, we had small communities engaging mainly in discussions within themselves. And that's just because the way that humans work is we engage in communication through voice. We engage in communication through language, through written works, among other things. And this is because oftentimes people only spoke their native language, but we think that now, when you have a universal language, you have increased this ability to communicate. And we want to make something clear in government. We are not shunning native languages, but we think that a universal language is another tool that individuals can use to express themselves now in multiple ways. We do not think this looks like banning native languages or banning your first language. We think that we just agree with the spread of a second language or a universal language that people can also adopt. No, thank you. But we think that there are so many dialects and languages and unique ways to communicate that other people cannot understand. So we think what this universal language does is it allows for an exchange of cultural ideas and conceptions of how we view ourselves in the world. I think a great example of this is the rise of Anglophone literature, like we've seen with Chinua Achebe's book, among other individuals in like the Turks and Caicos, who write their own cultural narrative, but using English as that platform. And this is so very important because it allows the global community to view those narratives that we probably wouldn't have access to if they were written in their native languages. Having that universal access allows so many more people to understand the cultural complexities of each other and understand how we view the world in different ways. We also think that a way to understand, and language is no thank you, I will get opening at the end of this point. We think that the way we understand and the way we communicate allows for this closeness of individuals that would otherwise have been impossible. We also think this is key to deconstructing viewing people as others or viewing people as not like ourselves. Because we think that when you have one thing in common, like a universal language, one, you can discuss things in common, but two, you have an innate relatability with that person. So we think that when you have a barrier like communication, that's one of the things we immediately shut off as humans. If we can't understand them, we're scared. If we can understand them, we don't want to understand what that person or what that individual is coming from. We think when we have a universal language, we deconstruct that fear barrier and that barrier to communicate, and we allow for an increased understanding. We think this is where it allows us to share stories that unite humanity as a whole, and we think especially coming from a global citizen and a global perspective, we think to have a global understanding is how we get the best impact to that. But I will take over.
Insofar as your access to the global economy is through English, don't you not think that governments in the developing nations would focus on English at the expense of local languages, local nuances and narratives? You can't have your cake and eat it too. Does globalization threaten national languages?
Sure. So we're going to be realistic. We think we yes, a threat of global to native languages from the spread of English. However, what we think English has done is, one, allowed individuals to express their concerns about the deconstructive or potential threat of their language, but two, we also don't think that these are mutually exclusive. We've seen a rise of English and native language schools. We can look towards Latvia as an example, where they have half of their school classes are taught in English, half of their school classes are taught in Latvian. We have a ton of other examples in Ukraine where it's a Ukrainian-English divide, among other things. We don't think it's either or, and we're not going to advocate for either or because we think this is a globalized world, and we see multiple bilingual, trilingual, even quadlingual people who just use English as a universal communicative tool while still maintaining their native language. We don't think that's incredibly unrealistic. On to my second point, economics, and why English as a universal language is so important to increasing accessibility to more people in the global market and in the global economy. Because we think economically, we would have had to have had a single business language is best, right? And we just think the way that the history has worked, it is English, right? So we think that English spread through business in the first part. We think we've seen a rise of individuals learning English to be able to engage in the business sphere. We can look towards China as an example. We can look towards a lot of the European states who require the learning of English, among other languages, to be able to engage in better partnerships. And we think that the reason why we have a universal language and should have it is because the spread of a singular language enables agency, but also enables a universal understanding of regulations and practices that allow people access to the global market. Because we think that if you grow up in a part of the region, maybe with a dialect or a language that isn't accessible, nobody's going to be able to do business with you because so much of business is negotiation, so much of business is meetings. We think having that universal language allows individuals who otherwise would have been excluded access to the market, access to the economy. That's why we think this universal language is so inherently important, because access to economic benefits is hinged to communication. We think access to markets is key, and English provides that link, again, because we have meetings and face-to-face interactions. We think in a world without the spread of English as a universal language, a lot of groups would be excluded from an otherwise accessible market, and we think that would be a regrettable world. For these reasons, the first of which is the spread of communication through a universal language, through English, allows us to better understand each other, allows us to better express our cultural narratives, and deconstruct the otherization we think we probably would still have if we didn't have a universal language, and it increases accessibility to people who otherwise would have been excluded. We are so very proud to propose.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to welcome the Leader of the Opposition to retort here.
Being a brown man growing up in Malaysia and having resented all of my English classes, I could not be happier to be speaking from where I'm speaking today. We think the privileging of English as a lingua franca, or any other language, lingua franca in that sense, unjustly privileges developed nations that have been speaking English for far longer, and unduly harms individuals that don't have English as a natural language on a metaphysical level that we will explore. So I'm going to get through every dimension of human experience and tell you why this world is worse off for people that don't speak that language. But first, let's do some characterization about what this kind of globalized world looks like. We think you do some of that, where trading is done in English, business spheres are primarily monopolized by English-speaking companies and MNCs, and services are provided in English to the point at which you interact with the call center, interact with the business, often that's done in English. But also locally, we think globalization means things that happen in your country and services that you interact with in your country happen in English. Knowledge access becomes one of accessing English to be able to access English translations of Greek texts, for instance, because we all love our philosophy. It also affects how you interact politically at the point at which voter pamphlets are in English, all of that. So how you interact socially at the point at which most people in your country are trying to speak English as opposed to your national language. All of this means locally in a country like Nigeria, if globalization were to continue in its trend, you're likely going to be interacting in every sphere of your life through English. We think this is harmful for a variety of different reasons. First argument, we think it harms people on a micro level when they try to get involved in the international business sphere. This is your biggest argument. You think that to participate in business, you have to speak English. That disproportionately privileges people that have better access to English by virtue of them, by birth lottery, living in countries that have English as a national language, or by birth lottery, having access to education systems with better English teachers, like Sheng Wu was imported from the UK, Harvard has a better debate program. That's what's going to happen, That's what's going to happen to a lot of places that have undue access to speaking English. at the expense of people who don't. This means that as an individual who didn't get education or perhaps had an inferior education in English, it's much harder for me to get a job at an MNC that particularly trades and deals with English. It's harder for me to get a job at the local call center where I'm expected to speak English and not Igbo or not Mandarin. We think these people are harmed on a microeconomic level. But on a much deeper metaphysical level, we think it puts a screen between a non-native speaker and all these aspects of life the speaker now has to do through English. It makes it more difficult for these people to have direct and immediate experiences with reality, insofar as that reality is transmitted through the medium of a different language. This is particularly harmful for all those groups of people who don't have access to learning English in the best way. And we say this is the large majority of people that live in developing nations all around that country. Secondly, though, and we think this is more important, we think people have a philosophical right to conceive of the world in their own way, and we think each language, inherent and implicit in each language, is a worldview, is a way of interacting with the world, a way of interacting with reality that sometimes is just non-translatable. What do we mean by this? We think different cultures have different conceptions of time as expressed in their language. Even translations show you this. Like, island nations from where I'm from, we generally don't care about time very much. We like to say we pass time. Time is literally passed. We step over it with grace and with taste. In the US, it's spending time. Time is a resource, a commodity. That's a very different way of conceptualizing time that we think different cultures have. Secondly, conceptualizing space. Many Igbo people don't have the word for east, west, north, or south because they conceive of space as a continuous astral that is substantival rather than directional. So they don't privilege any particular direction, and that's very important to their metaphysical conception of the way the sun rises. We think all of that is important. More than that, sometimes words can't be easily translated. To effectively speak in Mandarin, I need all different 8 words for rice. Problem is, if I had to translate that to English, now my one word has to become an entire paragraph to capture what I'm trying to say. So I have to say, rice coated in vinegar that has been left in the cellar for a certain amount of time. That's what I have to say rather than just Hong Shen. We think that's incredibly problematic for the efficacy of speaking that language. Now this is where we will interact with some of the material over here. Because they say it's important for me to be able to read Chinua Achebe. We think it's much worse when Chinua Achebe's story is misrepresented because a lot of the nuance and concepts of his unique story cannot be translated to English. Very likely, a Victorian English speaker that has been reading Joseph Conrad's version of Africa is going to read Nigeria. So I mean, this is a simplistic story. Like nothing is going on here. Oh my God, the speaker's not saying anything. But to a Nigerian speaker who understands the nuances of very simple, like narrative depictions of the world, that story means a lot more. We would much prefer a world where you interacted not at all, rather than the one in which you interacted with the worst and most misrepresented form of that nuanced people's culture. The worst thing is that these people feel the only way to tell their story and have their story told is to say it in English, and therefore they are forced to duress, literary duress. I've never used those 2 words together before, it's great. Literary duress, to sacrifice nuances that might be very important. This is how in your world you privilege English-speaking writers, and you will always have your problem of privileging Joseph Conrad and Virginia Woolf, bless her soul, over Chinua Achebe and all the other writers in the world. You don't get your story told, have a seat. Misrepresentation happens on your side of the house. Finally, this is the third argument, is that it forces people to internalize the fact that developed English-speaking world is better, and that generally white people in those worlds are better than us brown people. We think this has horrible, practical consequences because it forces people in the third world, developed worlds, often to internalize harm. This can manifest in 2 ways. Oftentimes in Malaysia, we don't take white people to court. Firstly, because we lose. They're oftentimes expats, as you heard in the expat debate. Total corporate capture of governments, no one's going to put them in jail or whatever. I'll take you before I go on.
Yeah, so you have identified a problem, but you don't actually solve for the inequality, because these individuals still speak languages while the Western world is going to march on without them. Never they think it's going to run.
We're going to show you how that happens better on the outside when countries can develop in their own way, rather than play your game at a disadvantage where they'll never succeed. Okay, so more than that, they don't question when their leaders get shortchanged in business. Like in Mumbai, people get into horrible trade deals with the G30 and G7, but because they accept the developing world is better, neo-colonization goes on to the point at which Indian people don't question it when they get the shorter end of the sticks in deals around the world. First, it's really traumatic to have conquered people speak the language of their conquerors, and we think it's not okay to trade off that kind of trauma just so you can make some money in the business field. Now let's talk about our comparative. We think Japan has maintained its national integrity and not speaking English since Meiji's time. That means in Japan, you're likely to see efforts translating the world of literature into Japanese, whereas in Malaysia that tries to speak English, those translations aren't available for Malay-speaking people. We think when Japan can have its own translations, by virtue of moving away from trying to learn English, but using all those resources to rather develop in their own way, focus on their own economies, and work on translation so that they can conceive of the world in their own way, they're more likely to enter the business world on their own terms. Alexandria was rich not because they all spoke Greek, but because they all pooled together resources. We can still have translators do what you need them to do. If it means I have to sacrifice all my English to second language trophies, and if it means I'll never another WUDC, I'm happy to do it. Defend local languages.
Thank you for that. Now, to continue the case of the government, it's Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Sam and I agree that there is a value to local languages. We believe that local languages should be preserved and should be something that are fought for. The only difference here is that we believe individuals, specifically marginalized individuals, have better access to the global economy, have better access to further systems of education, have better access to the global system if they also speak a universal language, or if they also are able to engage in both. The biggest problem that we have with the last speech is that overall, most of these distinctions that he explains between words and how language has distinctions within the ability and the way that we speak was done in English. It meant that the way that allowed me as an individual who speaks no other language but English and a couple words of a couple other languages, it means that the only way I'm able to understand that distinction is because someone was able to communicate to me in that language. It means that the value of this understanding of different cultures being able to use different words to express very different principles and having multiple meanings to them is only accessible to me as a listener if it's spoken in a language I understand. Because of this, we think this is a unique reason why we need to have, or why this expression or this expansion of English as a global or universal language is something that should be, it's a good thing, and this is something that should not be condemned. So today, for my point of positive matter, I'm going to talk about how narrative control is uniquely important. How individuals, and more especially marginalized individuals, having access to tell their own narrative and their own ability to speak, rather than using a translator or another individual to express for them, is uniquely important. But before I get on to that, I'd like to do some rebuttal. Overall, we agree with a lot of what OO has provided us today. The only issue is, though, we don't believe that any of it is exclusive. He's yet to tell us why specifically anything that they talk about is uniquely only applicable if I also speak English or if I also speak a global language. And we think this is going to be very harmful for them today in the round. However, we also believe that specifically there is an argument coming that when you prioritize learning English, it means that other languages get pushed to the side. Is that one, we think, in the current system, that we're able to both prioritize learning both languages, as in the system of Latvia, as in we think is what's happening in Ukraine, where you both have your cultural heritage ties, but you're also able to engage in this other type of expansion. And on top of this, is that we also think individuals, because we do believe that individuals who speak English or speak a global language are privileged over individuals who don't. That is a true narrative. The problem becomes that before we had this global language, we think those individuals were even more marginalized because they had absolutely no access or ability to engage. It means those individuals, not right now, those individuals did not have the ability to engage in small business acts because communication became so much harder. It meant that in order for me to do a business dealing with you, I need to find a translator. I need to find someone who is able to bridge the gaps between my communication with you and the language that you speak. It means that there's an entire second step that I must cross in order to business or in order to interact with you or understand where you are coming from. We think that distinction and that second gap is specifically harmful. We believe the spread of English, specifically to areas that do face more levels of extreme poverty, has been beneficial for those individuals because it allows them access to essentially other economic systems. It means that they can sell their goods not only in their local area, but also in their national state, also across the international spectrum. We think that this means that I can produce a good in Uganda and send that good essentially to the United States. It means that I can produce a good in the United States and send it anywhere else in the world. We think this type of exchange, cultural exchange, equals cultural exchange, one, but two, also economic and social benefits to the individuals who are living in areas that do face marginalization, that do face poverty. I'll take that.
Why should a culture's value to the individuals within it be determined by its accessibility to those who are not there?
That is a very good question. And we think at the end of the day, though, that we believe this is a benefits round, as in what is going to be the best world. And we think at the end of the day, we do think you get more benefits from marginalized individuals, and we would prefer, we think at the end of the day, if we have 10 suffering people or 8 suffering people, we would always prefer a world that had 8 versus 10. That we do think that there's no way to completely solve for all the world's problems, but we do believe that we need to make marginal benefits to towards people, and then we think this English allows for marginal benefits towards specifically marginalized people in other communities. We don't think you're going to get a lot of offense, like you're not going to generate a lot of offense saying that we don't solve the whole problem. This leads me to my point of positive matter that I really think is going, not right now, that I really think is going to be key, which I think is narrative control, and the ability for one individual, specifically marginalized individuals, to control the narrative that they speak, that they give. So essentially we think, before the ability to have like English or another universal language, that my ability to tell another person who does not speak my language is essentially on my ability to get a translator who's able to understand the nuances of what I'm telling you, the nuances essentially of the language that I am expressing. So that means that I need to find someone who is able to speak my language as well as I am, but also speak English. We think this already creates a separation and a divide. We also think my ability to speak to someone, specifically in any language, is always going to be different than what I'm able to tell you. For instance, we think the best example is what you're writing down on your flows, right? What you're writing on your flows is probably different than the exact words that are coming out of my mouth. Every translation that you have, there is a distinction between the individual who is giving the speech, the individual who's engaging in this type of written or spoken word, and what is actually produced, or the final product that can be experienced by other individuals. We think any attempt to remove these different steps, these steps that allow me to reach communication with another individual, are always crucial and will always be key. That we think that if I am able to speak to you directly, whether that's through written word, spoken word, or any other form of language, I have a better unique connection with you as an individual, and I'm better able to express my story. It means that I'm much less likely to have my story be corrupted or turned. The best example of this are the books that Sam gives the example of. This is an individual who speaks both English and their tribal language. This means that when they're able to write, those distinctions that we talk about between tribal words, or the words of their culture, they can have a better understanding of how exactly they translate and how exactly to express them. Because the problem is that if I do not know both languages intimately, or if I do not know my own language intimately, I'm going to have a hard time expressing the exact thing that I'm trying to say, meaning that it disrupts and it destroys my ability to communicate. So overall, why is this narrative control important? Because I do think I haven't walked quite to that level yet. We think this narrative control is important because when I don't control my own narrative, or when someone else writes it for me, they're the ones who are dictating my life. They're dictating essentially the authority over me as an individual and as a person. Meaning that when they're able to speak for me, they're able to dictate on what type of experiences I'm experiencing. What essentially this means is if I need to reach out for help, I am better able to express what I need than another individual who I'm asking for said help. So whether that's coming to like a request for aid, request for business, request for anything, I am the best individual to express my own needs. It's the reason why we don't want to speak for others, because the best individual to talk to is the person that's having the problem, that we don't go around the issues. So what have we brought you today is that we essentially think the ability to have one's own voice, control one's own narrative, is uniquely important. And we also believe this communication will always be key for the development of most marginalized individuals and also the development of the world. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Now, to conclude the first half of the debate, it's the DLO here.
My siblings and I, our biggest criticism of my mom, who came from Argentina, is that she didn't teach us Spanish when we were younger. She said that the reason that she didn't do this was because she thought that kids in school might stigmatize us if we were speaking a different language. They would look down on us as like uneducated if we were speaking in a tongue that they couldn't understand. So that bigotedness, which is like, because there are people who are bigoted, we have to then like submit to what they want, is the world that they're trying to defend. Which is, because certain people aren't able to understand you, and those people hold a lot of political and economic capital, we must then submit to their paradigm of ideals. What was unresponded to in Nish's speech is this idea that language is more than just words. There are certain words that aren't translatable from language to language. There are certain ideas that are not translatable into other languages. Meaning that if English becomes the universal language, people are only going to be able to contribute economically and ideologically in that type of English paradigm. We think that's abhorrent, and we also think that what was unresponded to is this idea that nations should be able to develop in their own way rather than develop as an English-speaking country. Okay, so a couple things at the top before getting into rebuttal and extension. So first, what they need to defend on their side of the house is both the process of this spread of English, meaning like who's going to be teaching it and what happens in that case, but also the end result, which is going to be like the erasure of other certain languages that like are not seen as conducive to like the global economy, right? Also, here's the comparative. The comparative is not don't develop or develop speaking English. The comparative here is either develop in your own way, using your own ideas, or no thank you, or develop in English. And we stand on the side of saying develop in your own way, don't constrain yourselves to the paradigm that is the language of English. Okay, no thank you. Response to what the DPM was telling us about narrative construction. So I think like you can kind of integrate the overview that I was telling you a little bit here, which like essentially is that they can't control their own narrative if there are certain ideas that they're unable to express. So even their example of like, oh, this person speaks their tribal language and they speak English, there are words most likely in their tribal language. I don't know their tribal language, unfortunately. Maybe if I had more of an incentive to do that, I would, but the global economy tells me that I shouldn't. But that there are words that aren't translatable, meaning you can't actually fully control your own narrative, right? So the turn here then is that in order to perform your narrative for like English speakers or people who like maybe you're trying to get grievances from, you have to function in their paradigm, which means that you lose your narrative. No thank you. Okay, so let's do then a little bit of sort of rehashing what Nish told you, because I thought it was really good analysis and I just don't really think it was engaged with. So first, like this whole idea of like people have a philosophical right to their own worldview, right? That there are different conceptions of time, different conceptions of space, that some words can't be translated, that people have unique personal stories. This idea of literary duress we think was important out of Nish's speech that was not responded to. No thank you. I'll get to you after rebuilding the case. But secondly, what Nish told you about these internalized harms. Notice that they just sort of completely ignore like what the world's actually going to look like when you have this dialectic of people who do speak English and people who don't speak English, right? So Nish tells you that there are certain harms where, like, if someone does speak the language and let's say like they're whiter, that they're like you're less likely to take them to court. Particularly if you don't even speak the language that they speak and your system operates in English, right? But that they're more likely to see themselves as less than if the people who have power and capital are the ones speaking English and they don't. So I don't think they get to start out defending a world where everybody speaks English, right? They have to defend the process of the spread of English, and we think that that's inherently harmful.
We agree with you. However, we believe individuals who speak both their native language and English have a benefit and an advantage in engaging in economic systems. It means that we're better able to help marginalized communities who did not have access to the world economy or even their national economy before they spoke a language that's understood.
So we think that there's a trade-off here, right? There are some individuals who will speak both languages. But the trade-off is that if you prioritize and welcome the spread of English as a global language, that you are necessarily erasing, slowly, other languages and other forms of ideas and traditions, right? So there is a trade-off. Don't let them get away with it. And the reason that trade-off is so important, like why we think there actually will be erasure of other languages, is because all their benefits are contingent upon like everybody speaking English, so everybody can have access to the global economy. So the second thing to recognize on this trade-off, right, is that as English is spreading, we have to ask ourselves, no thank you, who is the one doing the teaching of English? Is it local native tribes people teaching English to their own? Or is it the people who already have the resources and capital from their home English-speaking countries who can go into these impoverished, generally darker, less English-speaking countries and basically then get the benefit, number one, of teaching them English and getting that payment, but number two, also then get the benefits of whatever it is that their integration is in the global economy. Because if they concede, the global economy function like is essentially best understood in the language of English, means that those who own the levers of the global economy speak English, which means they're only going to accept their integration into that economy insofar as it benefits themselves. That's how economies work. No, thank you. Okay, so now I want to talk to you about so principally, like this idea of like, why should we reward colonizers, right? And I think that like they don't really engage with this material very much. So Nish touched on it, but I want to like say this, right? Like the idea is that the adage is, no thank you, that crime doesn't pay, right? That you shouldn't incentivize people for wrongdoing. But when we look at the most impactful, most severe colonizer that has existed on the face of the earth, it is the most English-speaking country. It is England, right? It is the British. So what it means is, by them colonizing and plundering and then ultimately making their language the language of the world, you're telling people that if you commit human rights abuses and dominate and subjugate other people to your will, ultimately you will be able to control them, because the only way that they will be able to communicate with you is in their language, and you control all the power anyway. So we think it makes protected time. We think that it makes ultimately like people subservient in that sense. So, look, I really like the song Despacito, right? I don't even know what it means. Meaning that I can still get the like that there are certain ideas, certain sounds that are contributed in other languages that just can't be duplicated. So we think like that's sort of the way of doing that. So I think ultimately now, like when I go home and I talk to my mom and I'm like, oh, you really should have taught me Spanish, I think one of the harms now that I feel myself is that I fall into the trap of thinking, well, if someone doesn't speak my language, they should speak my language. When in reality, like I have no incentive to learn their language. We think it's a better world where I have an incentive to learn other languages, where people have an incentive to learn whatever languages they want, not coerced because it's necessary to communicate in a global economy. We are proud to oppose.
Okay. Thank you for that. Now to continue the debate for government side, it's the member of government here.
So I listen to a lot of music, and I understand that not everybody listens to Death Grips or Carly Rae Jepsen, but we do understand that music is often the way that we relate to other individuals because it is a common understanding that we have between each other. We think that English, similarly, can be that common language, literally, in terms of communicating and identifying and relating to each other. What I really want to talk about in my extensive material, because I think Talcott did a really good job talking about a lot of the practical benefits in terms of people integrating into like greater economies and people being able to actually talk to each other and understand each other. But I want to talk about why having a common language is going to help decrease socio-cultural barriers that we have between each other and build relationships. But before that, I have 3 points of deconstruction for you. First, opening opposition really hangs a lot of their case on dying languages. Look, we preserve languages in the status quo, and there's languages that are dying. But additionally, I wonder how much opening opposition would pay in order to preserve ancient Babylonian and Sumerian languages. Languages do die, and we understand that, but when we think there is a value in terms of preserving them, but we have to understand that if there is a great, broad common language as English, we think that is something to value. Second point of deconstruction is talking about a lot of this new colonialism that happens, where individuals are going to internalize their oppression because people who come from non-Western nations have to learn English. A couple of responses of this. First of all, we think that in terms of who are teaching these languages and who's teaching English to these individuals, we think that these can come from classes that are within these communities. They can come from NGOs or other places that teach English, the place where you volunteer to help people, right? But I think that additionally, even if you have only rich foreigners who are privileged and they're the only individuals that can access these English languages, we think that they can still come back to their communities or talk to their family members and help communicate, help them learn English and help them learn the language. The final point of deconstruction, though, is talking about how we can't reward colonialism, and what we should rather do then is provide this alternative where we should learn other languages. But when we're talking about weighing the debate, talking about what is more efficient, we think that when we're talking about what's most important, we think it's this idea of relationships and being identify yourself with other individuals. That's the most important principle that we're going to push over. And we think that you're going to get that towards the English language rather than everyone learning a variety of different languages, which is fine too. English just should be the primary one. Sure.
The reason ancient Babylonian and Sumerian isn't around anymore is because colonizers killed all those people. If you're okay with languages being created now, you have to defend the altruism of NGOs to give people access to English. How reliable is an altruism, and how reliable is your education of English in the third world?
15.
Okay, so we think that the destruction of those ancient colonies are it's much more than just promotion of English. That was literal colonizers and all these wars and all of that. But anyway, I want to move on to my extension material. First, I want to talk about how language is important for inclusivity. Second, why language influences our actions. And third, why English is important for breaking down the socio-cultural barriers. But first, this principle of why this language is important for inclusivity. So we think that we're really pushing this principle that inclusivity is important. Why is that? We think that as individuals, when we are born, we are lost. We don't really know this environment that we are relating to. We grow up as children trying to learn what are the norms that are around us. What are these abstract concepts that are more than just, the food that I'm eating every day or the friends that I have. And we think that the reason why we want this inclusivity is that we want to identify with individuals. We want to form relationships, and we want to form bonds and empathize and have other people understand our human experience. We think that this is something that's evolutionary, but it's something that is prevalent in the modern day. Language is the most essential thing in order to communicate that a common experience. If I am speaking English to you and you can understand me, that's important. We think it's important on a couple of levels. We think it's important in communities, that don't primarily speak English, but we can use that English as a common barrier. When I can actually talk to my grandma, even though she's all from the Philippines, because she has some solace of understanding English, even though there's that cultural barrier, I can understand what her experience was like post-World War II from that different culture. We think that is important within these smaller communities. But we think on a broader standpoint, if you are a person from a different country and you emigrate over into a Western country, that type of communication is important. And we think that additionally, when opposition recognizes that these big outgroups like these Western nations are the ones that are creating this oppression and are creating these problems, then if you are able to speak English and communicate this oppression that you are experiencing from them, that is the type of connection and empathy that we want. Second, I want to talk about why language influences our actions and how it does that. What does language do? A couple of things. First, we think we have this thing called microdialogue, right? Where we just have basic conversations and speech acts that we have to each other on a day-to-day basis. We think that when you are able to learn English, that's important because if you are a person who just emigrated from South America and into the United States, and you're literally just trying to buy something from the store, we think that language is important for that individual to understand you, not only on a practical level, but on a deeper level where they're trying to empathize with the struggles that they're trying to have. But we think that additionally, microdialogue influences our societal values and our policies, our ideologies that we have on a day-to-day basis. Additionally, we think that the differences in language transmit the different values that we have onto people. Look towards African American vernacular, where in our society people look to that as something lesser because they associate that dialect and that language with those individuals. Look additionally to people who are ESL speakers who are discriminated because they can't effectively communicate. When you have people though that are all gravitating towards this common language, what you do have is this common understanding where you break down the social values that are connected to the differences in language. But finally, I want to talk about how specifically English is going to break down those sociocultural barriers. So we think it's important is inclusivity. It's this ability to build relationships and for people to understand each other, because that's not something that's only inherent within Western states, but we think that's something that is common just as a person, right? So we think that, first of all, immigrants who have to learn English are going to have an ability to learn the language. And once again, if it's only privileged people that can get access to this, they can talk about English and they can teach it to people within the community. Secondarily, we think it's important in terms of communicating oppression, because that's what the opposition really, really cares about. And you can communicate your internalized oppression only if you can actually speak to and talk about that with people who similarly speak English. But finally, we think that people who are oppressors can have this ability to help cultural preservation. You can help preserve dying cultures and dying languages. You can help trying to transmit the cultural value of these other things. But you cannot have that if you don't have that common thread of communication. We think English is the key to that. Proud to propose.
For that, now it's to the member of the opposition to retort. Here.
In the Talmud, there is a famous story wherein Moses is visited by God in a dream and shown a vision of a rabbi in the future teaching to the children of Israel. And Moses is dismayed because he cannot understand the teachings that this Rabbi Akiva is producing. And God tells him, do not worry. For many years from now, there will be a teacher who will derive Jewish law from the crownlets upon the letters that were given to you on the 10 Commandments. And these things can change and are not always static. We believe that religion is one of the most important and binding aspects of human nature, and one of the things that gives us both our sense of place and meaning in the world. Opening opposition gave you a beautiful and compelling defense of an individual's right to language and how that helps them understand and instantiate their culture in the world. On closing opposition, we want to tell you what a world where only a few religions dominate looks like. We tell you it looks like a world unmoored from our history and rejected from our place in the universe. 3 points in this speech, most deconstructed. disruption will be interwoven. First, I'm going to talk about the importance of religion. Second, how language and religion intersect in the status quo. And finally, what a world where only dominant religions continue to exist looks like. First, the importance of religion. We posit to you on closing opposition that religion and the spiritual experience for those who choose to engage with it and find it valuable is the most important part of their human experience and their existence. It is the only thing that can answer or even begin to answer the questions like why are we here and what comes next. Because even all of our understandings of science and the great advances that we have made can still only grasp at the rough edges of the conception of what a soul is, where it comes from, and why it continues to exist. People will go without food for religion. They will sacrifice themselves for their beliefs because they feel these things are so important to their identity that literally nothing else matters. We think in this case that it is quite literally the most important thing in the debate to be able to preserve the way that people around the world are able to engage with the spiritual and to carry out their daily lives with the confidence that they have a place in the universe of which they are certain and a place they are going where they are happy to be. Second, now, let us speak of how language and religion intersect in the status quo. Because recognize that large monotheistic religions will probably be able to survive. Many of them have undergone language transitions in the past. Christianity was translated from Hebrew to Greek into various forms of English. The Vatican II Commission gave the go-ahead for masses to be conducted away from just Latin and into Spanish. These religions, such as Judaism, which is also preferenced Hebrew language over the Yiddish language in Israel, have shown their viability and have shown their durability. What we are losing in this world right now, what we are losing thanks to the focus on English and the growth of single languages, are the smaller religions, those practiced only by a few groups, the shamanists, the polytheists, the animist religions, the tribal languages that often don't translate their concepts or the names of their deities into ideas with which we are familiar. Look to the difficulties in translation that the Aztec descendants have had with the serpent god Quetzalcoatl, and how many different names there can be in Spanish or English, but none of them really get at the true meaning of what that deity is and what it means to those people. When Tlingit language has 6 different names for the word raven, and all of them are different because the raven is so central to that mythology and to those people that you literally cannot engage in the rituals of remembering your descendants and remembering those deities if you are unable to speak the words and individuals watching are unable to participate. When you cannot engage in this form of ritualistic instantiation, there is no way for that religion to be passed on, and there is no benefit that can be gained from it. We tell you that this ought outweigh all other aspects of this round because we tell you that the world can continue to develop with different languages as it has for centuries. Islamic finance can continue to develop alongside regular finance. We can continue to have different conceptions of how business ought to be done as opposed to just how the English speaking world thinks it should be done. And I'll take opening in a moment. But what you cannot replace are the worlds and the myths that you lose when those languages can no longer be understood by anyone and are no longer written down by anyone, because no one believes them to be relevant anymore, and all we believe in are the remaining religions that are fortunate enough to have the backing of the English-speaking world. Opening.
The issue becomes this is not exclusive, and also the only way as an English speaker I'm able to understand that there are 6 different words for the word raven is your ability to speak English and also have a translator out of that religion. We think this brings better depth and breadth to the world. This is not exclusive.
This references the POI that I asked earlier. What is the value of culture? Opening government would have you believe that culture is valuable and religion is valuable insofar as only other groups can understand it and access it. We do not believe this to be true. Otherwise, the culture of the North Sentinelese people who have never been contacted by other humans would be considered moot and we would have no problem in wiping their island off the face of the earth if it was valuable for natural resources. We believe that culture to be valuable even if none of us have ever spoken to or it will ever speak to a North Sentinelese individual. That is why we preserve it, because those individuals believe it to be valuable in and of themselves, and that is a net good that exists in a world where they believe can only exist in the terms of interactions. We think individuals can make those interactions for themselves. Third, now, what does a world look like where only the dominant religions continue to exist? We think first it is a gray and fraying tapestry of human existence. There is no depth, there is no color, there is no acknowledgement of the religions from which we sprang, and the religions which many other monotheistic religions took influence from. There is no conception of the melting pot that existed when individuals who came across and attempted to bring Christianity to Central America began to look into Central American myths to also adapt and look for points of commonality between their spiritual leaders. We think people become ignorant of our history. These works, these masks, languish in museums where no one ever attempts to read them. And even those in the status quo who go to museums, we tell you, have a much better chance of understanding the value of that religion and the value of those works and those rituals when there are people still living and breathing who can practice them. When you can watch the video of the dance and the drum circle, and even if you don't understand it, you can understand that it means something to them. And that's all that matters. It doesn't matter what it means to me if only it means something to the individuals for whom their very life depends upon it, and it is their only connection to the past that we have seized from them in every other manner. We think at a more practical level, you are also likely to see religious backlash from older generations who feel rejected now not only by the youth who no longer speak with them, but who no longer identify with their gods or believe their myths to be legitimate. This is how you fray the seeds of discord and contempt between generations all around the world and among different populations when we reject the myths of the past and say only those religions which were fortunate enough to have the backing of English-speaking countries can continue to perpetuate. Only those religions and those gods which were fortunate enough to have their prophets translated into English are the ones that we believe worthy of continuing in the human canon. The religious experience is the most important experience for individuals that choose to opt into it because it quite literally defines their existence on this planet and in whatever comes next. When languages die, spirits and rituals die with them, and those can never be retrieved.
Thank you for that. Now to conclude the government side of affairs, we welcome the government whip. Here, here.
The member of opposition cheats in this debate because usually I have to whip his material and I'm incredibly partial to it. Additionally, we're very close friends, and he knows that I am a cynical, agnostic individual who has very, very ignorant views on religion. So it's going to be incredibly hard for me to deconstruct. I'm going to take a different tactic. I'm going to concede everything that Sam said and said that he is right. He is speaking to truth. He is doing what persuasive speakers are supposed to do. Unfortunately, what he's not doing is debating. He's not giving you reasons in comparative language to the way that we understand the world. Because here's a thought experiment for you. If a parent in the Western world decided that they wanted to raise their child only having that child know ancient Egyptian and Egyptian hieroglyphics, we would think that would be wrong for some reason. Because they might have some wonderful worldview that comes from those Egyptian hieroglyphics that only they can fully understand, but they would have no one to communicate with. They would be vacuous, and they would be empty. Because we think they're far more important than the languages that might be left in the dust, unfortunately, and it truly is an unfortunate fact, and we will concede that it's an unfortunate fact, is people who are left in the dust without the opportunity to choose the lives that are valuable to them. Because what you do when you preserve these languages and don't offer options like universality and opportunity to every person is you condemn them to no choices. You condemn them to communities that are being pushed out by the multinational corporations that opening opposition talks about but never solves for. You continue to make sure that their rights are stripped away by Western powers, and when we recognize that, we have to start with solutions. And it might be suboptimal that languages go away, but inevitably saving the people and the intent behind those people is what's far more important. I will offer you one small bit of mitigation, and that is that we live in a wonderful technological world, and I hope that Sam goes to every ancient community before English crowds them out and records them, and takes pictures of them, and takes images of the things that are important to them, and stores those in places where someday, hopefully, we get to the point where we can understand them and experience them and spread them all around the world for people to experience, right? But if that is only what you can have, to trade that off for people being pulled out of poverty, for people having opportunity, we're happy to advocate for that on proposition. No, thank you. I want to talk about three things in this debate. The first, I'm going to talk a little bit about economics, then we're going to talk about inequality, and finally, about meaning and value. First, on economics. Inevitably, government bench is going to win the economic questions, right? There are efficiencies, and massive efficiencies, credit to OG, that we get from having this type of communication and ability to cooperate. But it goes beyond simple like, oh, we have the ability to conduct business. Because when you are all on the same page, you're able to form unions like the European Union, where you can communicate with one another and create political frameworks that inevitably lift people out of poverty. It's not just economics. It's about economics leveraging itself into the things that people want, to safety, to security, security, towards the ability to take and decide what you want to do with your life. That's what we uniquely give you on our side of the house. The opening opposition offers you an example of Mumbai, and it's terrible that Mumbai is getting taken advantage of. But I'll tell you that multinational corporations aren't going to stop, and people in Mumbai aren't going to stop learning English. It's whether or not you think a couple of people who know English in Mumbai should have that privilege and have that experience and have that ability or that advantage that they talk about, or if everyone in Mumbai deserves that opportunity. And if more people knew English and knew the contracts when they were reading, whether or not there would be fairer terms to those agreements. And we tell you absolutely and unequivocally you would if everyone had that same sort of advantage and everyone were able to access those global markets. To the same degree that when Native Americans were unsure of what those colonizers were doing to them and what they were asking and requesting of their land, we think that the eradication of them happened even though they were trying to preserve their culture. Yes, colonization is bad, but either way, the growth of the world economy is coming, and you cannot stop that on your side of the house. You needed to reconcile that. So we think on economics, it's going to happen, and it's about how we adjust. On inequality, this is where it becomes really important, because opening government tells you about narrative control, which we think is a massive form of power, right? The ability to determine for yourself what is being said. But Genevieve uniquely extends this into power into ways that are practical and ways that you actually can benefit your community. Because beyond just being able to articulate what is on your mind, we are able to actually leverage that access. When you have individuals who grow up in the slums of India and then go to top-tier universities, they are able to come back to your communities and be change agents there. They are the type of people who leverage the rights of their own people and continue the population. Not necessarily the culture, but they do it for the people who are there. And we think along the way, you create blends, right? She talks to you a little bit about AAVE and how new communities can form, and those communities can be valuable and distinct and powerful, but they still have the access to speak to their legislators, and they still have the access to get bank loans, and they still have the access to the world markets that allow them to lift themselves out of poverty and gain prosperity. Additionally, though, even if it's not that you are sending cultural ambassadors to learn languages, we think that by knowing the global language, you're able to communicate the true problems that are happening to you. And here is what's vitally important and opposition bench misses. It's not just about speaking. It's about being heard. And the difference here is that someone, when you are speaking English, actually understands. And they're more likely to empathize with you, they're more likely to listen to you, and they're more likely to be able to find some negotiation or way that everyone can be benefited rather than just being rolled over in the long term. If opening has a point, I'll take that.
For me, as a community, to make money in your world, I have to learn to speak English, and under economic duress, I have to relinquish my access to my language. How then can you defend this as a legitimate choice on behalf of individuals and communities to opt into that world?
So that is a factual statement. What you had to offer was an alternative, where if you grew up in a tribal community, you had the opportunity to make money and advocate for your people against governments who refused to learn or hire translators. You had to find circumstances where your people were ever able to find benefit in this world, because it's unfortunate that the Western world is ignorant, but they do not have any desire to listen to the tribal languages of a certain locale. They are just going to bulldoze you or go somewhere else. It's a sad but unfortunate truth. Inevitably, we think that we address the inequalities identified by the opposition bench. We take the material that some people are advantaged in this world, and by spreading global language, we take away one of those characteristics that holds back everybody who does not have that advantage. Finally, on meaning, right? I can't tell you what the power of your soul is. That is something for all of you to decide. And I hope that you do find a religion that you can find a way to figure that out. But what I can give you is the opportunity to choose for yourself what that religion will be. And I can give you that because I'm able to offer you things that make your community prosperous, that make your family prosperous, that allow for you to communicate and build relationships, whether they be from people here or people in Japan or people in sub-Saharan Africa, right? Any way that you want to connect with the world, I can offer that to you through English, because English is a language of opportunity. Its universality is its leverage that allows you to create tangible gains that allow you to determine the life for yourself that is valuable. Yes, certain people in tribal villages will live wonderful lives, but those who get pushed over or pushed aside by the world economy will live terrible lives. At least what we can do on our side of the house is guarantee everybody has that option to choose a life that is valuable to them and give them the economic capital to make sure it happens.
For that, now to conclude our debate as a whole, we welcome the opposition whip. Here.
My half-sister is half Tlingit and half white. What language do you think she speaks? It's English. My half-sister was raised, even though she's half Tlingit, as a Christian. What religion do you think she practices? This means my sister has no connection to half of her identity, half of her being. And this is something I have watched her struggle with her entire life, wondering how she connects back to that personhood that she has an identity with, but was never taught how to connect back to. I think that's what government misses in this debate, because it's not just about what happens next. It's what happens to the future generations who are raised with English as their first language, never getting to know that other native language of their people, and never getting to know what their ancestors imparted on them, and that kind of culture and history that comes with that. That is where we think they lost this debate, because we think that there are two important questions to ask in this round. It is what happens first, and then what happens in the future. But first, some deconstruction. Out of Jacob's speech, and out of all of government, we get this idea that the only way you can actually access the benefits of the world is if you can get money, if you can get material possessions. But look at the way they frame it for you. They use an English conception of what wealth looks like, when I can tell you from my sister's culture, if she had been able to access it in the Tlingit religion or spirituality, being wealthy has to constitute with the amount of people around you who love you and share your good. Wealth is not just material possession, and wealth is not just being able to create a business and seeing it succeed. Using his English frame of this idea of wealth, we've already seen where translations get lost in history and in the future, and that's one of the reasons we're not proud for this motion to go through. So, what two questions do I have to answer to show you exactly why Sam and I have won this debate? The first is what happens next, and the second is what happens in the future, basically dealing with what has happened to my sister. The first idea is what happens now, because one of the reasons my sister doesn't know how to speak any Tlingit is because people brutally oppressed the Tlingit people so that they were not allowed to speak their language, so that they were sent to boarding schools and literally abused if they were caught using any of those words or using anything that had any speak of their religion. Sam tells you why religion is so important, but now they can't even access it because they've forgotten it because they were abused if they were taught it, and they're psychologically not able to access that anymore because of the ways we teach people not to access their culture.
So, my mother was adopted from China, but I don't think that I am half a person because I never got to touch my Chinese ancestry or like Chinese culture. And I don't think any of you who have descendants from all over the world feel like you have missed out because you have missed one of the many cultures that you can access value from. That's what we need to answer. Defend dead cultures.
That's one perspective. But for some people, that identity is really inherent to their being because they are raised in a place where that identity forged these communities that they look around them and say, look at that beautiful totem pole. Why don't I understand its meaning? Because that meaning was taken away from you. So, opening opposition answers this question really well of what happens now. We get this conceptualization that there's going to be a discrepancy in the developing world, that there's going to be concepts that are lost in translation, like your concept of time, like your concept of color, these kinds of things. But we think the wealth of the material that you need to answer the debate on is what happens in the future. And this is what Sam tells you, is that when you have a loss of language, you necessarily have a loss of culture, because the two are ingrained together. The way you speak informs the way that you believe. The way you believe informs the way that you act out on people and become a moral actor. So we think that in this sense, culture becomes this inherent sense to identity, that without it, you are not able to be the person or the actualization of what you wanted to be in the world. So, what does this mean? We think that in the future, it means you get a generation of people who never were able to connect back to that ancestry, never able to connect back to that history. And not only is that emotionally and psychologically damaging for that person, it's also damaging for the world because you no longer have these conceptualizations of different ways of thinking. Sam is the only one to tell you that it's not good only to have one type of religion that's monotheism, that only cares about one higher power. He's the only one that tells you that we need this type of culture to have these types of spirituality that push us into thinking about different things in different ways. One really good example of this that ties directly back to Sam's material. Bali water temples. Who here knows about Bali water temples? Probably not a lot of us because we tried to kill them.
But essentially, what Bali water temples are is this idea of their language and their culture inform their practices of agriculture and farming. And that even though they didn't understand the science behind it, they understood that by trial and error, and by using language and culture as mechanisms to store their past ideas of trial and error, they were able to formulate the best and most exact situation that would do the best good and make their crop most available for everyone. What happens when English speakers went in and didn't care about any of that culture and didn't care about any of that language? We went in and said, you need to do what the Green Revolution says, which is use our pesticides and use our growth hormones to make your stuff better. What happened there? We lost this entire way of thinking that was actually more efficient than the Green Revolution, and then realized, man, we effed up. We got to go back to the Bali water temple way of thinking. But if English becomes the only language that is accessible to you, then you no longer have these different ways of thinking, and you no longer have these different ways of trial and error that are encapsulated in our language and in the exact way that our culture has manifested itself to best benefit ourselves. So I think there's only one way you can see this debate going. And that is, you have to vote for the side that thinks in the broadest way, that asks, how can you best help the most people to think about innovative ways of bettering the world? Think about other conceptualizations of what does wealth and poverty mean, and think about other conceptualizations of what does it mean to be your own person and to find your identity. For my sister, it might have helped if she had been able to connect back more to her own spirituality of half of her ethnicity than being forced to take the one that was only promoted on her. We think that's the real harm in this debate, is that you get people in the future who don't know what they've lost because it's been taken from them before they can actually recognize its wealth and its nature in this world. That's why we're so proud to oppose.
All right. Sounds good.